on this computer. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Consenting to record. And actually, I don't want to start that way anyway. Since this is a small group, one thing that I always like to know is what is something that you would like to leave with before we get started, because I want to make sure I cover that. There's nothing more frustrating than knowing that you're going to go to a workshop or something, and then the one thing that you came for, the person didn't talk about. And also just introduce yourself and give me kind of like one fact about you. Or no, we're not going to do that. That's not structured enough. So tell me what you're doing for vacation or a staycation. Okay. My name is Sarah Schmitt, and I'm interested in what you would like to get out of this today. And I just got back from 3 days at a place called Cub World with 5 boys and girls who were hot and dehydrated and complained the whole time. That was my vacation. I'm sunburned. And ultimately we had fun, but we had a, it was challenging. Almost hands with an 8-year-old at the pool. So glad to be home, but also glad to have had that time with my son and his friends. So, and I will pass it to you, Emily.
Okay. Emily Hudson, and I am planning on going on vacation in another week or so to Myrtle Beach. My son and daughter-in-law invited me to go with them, so I'm going to hop on, and looking forward to that. One thing that I'd like to for us to get out of this is the just some oral history techniques, because they are going to be conducting some oral history interviews, and I want to equip them and prepare them to be able to do that. And our 2 interns, Shakina Jones and Christiana Linden, and so I will give it to Christiana to introduce herself.
My name is Christiana Linden. For vacation, I'm going to Destin, Florida this Saturday. And one thing that I would like to take away from this is also what Miss Emily said, just some techniques and stuff.
Shakina.
My name is Shakina Jones. For vacation, I'm going to Tennessee in July. I hope to take away from this more ways that I can do an oral history well.
Okay.
All right. So what I had started to say was that the Kentucky Oral History Commission, we're located in the Historical Society, and we've been around since 1976, and you might recognize that date as being the bicentennial. There are a lot of things like this created to celebrate the bicentennial, and a lot of them aren't still around, and we're one of them that has survived. And the reason, the interesting thing about oral history is people will call me and ask me for Civil War oral histories, and to politely explain to them that you're not going to see or find many oral histories before the 1960s. And the reason that is oral histories are necessarily recorded interviews. And obviously during the Civil War, we didn't have the capability to do recordings. And the reason why an oral history became popular around that time, because the 1960s, that is, because the equipment to do it became more affordable, and it became easy. You could go out and get it at Radio Shack. You didn't have to be a professional. You could use magnetic tape, cassette tapes. So that's a lot of what we have here. We have about 10,000 oral history interviews. It's one of the largest collections in the country here at the Kentucky Historical Society, but we've helped create about 40,000 more around the state. So one of the biggest things that we do, I don't exist to do oral history interviews. I'm here to make sure that other people in other communities around the state have the opportunity to do them and to document their own history and culture and not have that coming out of Frankfurt. Because, you know, the whole story doesn't get captured that way. And is everybody located in the same county here, Emily?
Yes, we're in Perry County.
Okay.
That's where we are kind of situated, but we
Mhm.
plan on reaching out to the counties surrounding us, Leslie, Breathitt, Knott, Letcher, those that touch our borders, and eventually
Cool.
beyond that.
Well, the cool thing is Kentucky is considered one of the leaders in oral history. The Youth Center at UK is the best program in the world, probably. And part of the reason for that is because Kentuckians were doing oral history very early on because they realized that there were lots of parts of the historical record that most of the folks in rural areas in particular didn't have access to. So for example, we have a huge artifact and archival collection, but a lot of that is people from a certain class, from a certain area, of a certain color, of a certain religion, of a certain race, certain ethnicity, right? Because those, you know, a lot of folks, if you had material culture like a quilt or something, you used it up, you wore it out, you made it work, or you did without. And so you don't have things like that to donate. Whereas wealthy people who could have multiple coverlets, they could preserve them and send them in and have artifacts. And people recognized early on that the stories of people in Kentucky who use their resources effectively like that were just as important. So how are we going to record it? Well, what they have is their voice. And actually, one of the earliest collections of oral histories we have are from Lee's Junior College, which is now part of the Southeast Technical College system, and I think was absorbed into the Hazard campus. So you have examples of this kind of right in your backyard, which is really cool. So moving on. These are the guys that established that they were actually not oral historian, they were journalists. And I like to say that oral history is essentially journalism with some time to reflect. We're not trying to get the scoop, but we do a lot of things that journalists do in terms of asking questions. We're just more sensitive about it, one, and we give people time to process things before we start asking questions. And we try to be a unifying influence too, because there's all these collections around the state, and we want to make sure that everybody has the resources they need to preserve those interviews. So what is an oral history? And you'll note that I have highlighted some key words in this because I think they're important to emphasize. So it's a recorded dialogue between two people that captures personal memories of historic significance. So like I said already, oral history is a technology dependent. You have to have a recording device for it to be considered oral history. It's not written down. That's important too. Those are called oral traditions, but it's not the same thing. And then dialogue. So the interview is not a conversation and it's not an inquisition. Okay. So it's not really two people talking back and forth equally like a conversation is. And you're not interrogating people. You're not asking for just the facts. We're getting deeper. We want to know about the experience, the feelings, and things like that. I really like to emphasize two people because it's very tempting to want to do oral histories with multiple people, so you get all those voices. The problem with that is, and I'm sure you all have seen this before if you've ever been in a group, people act differently in a group and say different things in a group than they might say one-on-one. They change their story, right? And it's not that they're lying. It's just they have what's called social desirability, right? You want to make sure you're still friends by the end of the conversation. And so you're going to tell it a certain way. The other thing is when we record these stories later on, when researchers listen to them and there's multiple voices talking, especially if you have multiple women and multiple men and they sound very similar, like family members, right? We can't tell if it's James or John or Kevin who's talking when they answer a question, and we want to be able to attribute what they said to them. So It's just better and easier if it's two people. Now, there are some exceptions. Married people sometimes are a unit and they have a collective memory. They have things that they remember as a couple, and it's better to interview them together. Sometimes there's the opposite of that with a married couple. One person's the talker and the other person can't get a word in edgewise, or they're constantly trying to correct each other's memories. You know how it is, like, it didn't go that way. That is not what she said. Now, this is how it happened. So, you know, you may decide, depending on that couple's dynamic, how they relate to each other, that they should be interviewed together or they shouldn't. And sometimes when you try to interview a married couple, even if it is just the one person, the other spouse will come into the room and try to interrupt anyway. So, you know, you just do the best you can in those kinds of situations. But two people, an interviewer and an interviewee, is ideal. The other thing that I always like to stress and emphasize to people is that oral history should never be taken alone. They should always be taken in the context of the whole historical record, because we are dealing with personal memories. And as you know, people aren't liars. They're not lying on purpose, but memories can lie. Every time you recall something that happened to you, you're actually changing it by recalling it. And so you always want to make sure that when you're documenting a historic event, that you want to use newspaper articles and diary entries and other types of primary sources. Oral histories are important, but you always want to make sure that you're, you know, getting as many sources as you can. And you want your questions for your oral histories to be informed by those things anyway. So as long as you're collecting them, you know, we do have great examples out of Harlan County. There's an oral historian who's Italian that took an interest in the mining culture of Harlan County, Alessandro Portelli. But he also did a project in Italy around an industrial disaster. And everybody that he interviewed said that it happened on a certain date. And the newspaper records, the industrial documentation said it happened the day before or day after. I can't remember which. And that can, even though it's a discrepancy, that can be just important, or just it's telling, like, why is that? Why is it that it's remembered different? So that's why it's important to take everything all together, because it's not the facts, okay? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. We're just getting people's recollections of it. And last but not least, historic significance. They don't have to be events in the very distant past, but we're not recording in the moment the same way a journalist is. And I think too, it's important to interview people of all ages at different stages of their lives. So we have lots of interviews with like World War II veterans. And a lot of those folks, they waited to interview them when they were in their late 70s up into their 90s. And I wish that someone had interviewed them when they just came back, or when they were in their 40s, because as you know, as you grow, you reflect on things differently. As your life changes, when you get married, when you become a mother, when you achieve different levels of education, you really start thinking about things differently. So, I mean, I think we should be interviewing 17-year-old people right now about their experience in the pandemic. So let's not assume that an oral history has to be done with somebody who's 95 years old. That's important too, don't get me wrong, but really think broadly. Historic significance doesn't mean ancient history. It just means we know that it is going to be important in the future and people are going to want to know about it. So a lot of people are intimidated by oral history, especially the equipment, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And they'll tell me, I'm not an oral historian. This is my grandmother's cookbook, and she was a terrible cook. You notice the burner mark, she left it on a burner. That's probably the only thing she ever did with that cookbook. She made like 2 different things and that was it. And she didn't even do those very well, but nobody starved, right? You can look at me and tell that nobody in our family is going hungry. And what I would say to you is, don't be intimidated. The key to this is Don't tell anybody, especially don't tell my supervisor, but anybody can do this. All it is pressing record and asking questions. And it's better to have a bad oral history with somebody than no oral history at all. So don't, and I'll go ahead and tell you a story. You are going to mess up. You are going to mess up so bad. You just have to, it's like anything else, you have to practice. So one of the first oral histories that I ever did, this was back in the day when we still did things on cassette tape. And I went to do an interview with this woman who was from a small town in Kentucky, and she earned her PhD in anthropology. She went to India and did all of this awesome field work. And I was so taken in by her story and how cool she was. She finished side A of the tape. I took it out, turned it over, recorded side B. Wasn't paying attention when side B was done, took it out, turned it over, and recorded over side A. Now, the beautiful thing is with recording equipment now, that doesn't happen. But I went back to my advisor, my graduate advisor at college, and I was like, you're not going to believe what I've done. And she just looked at me and said, you know what? The worst thing that can happen to you has already happened. So you're good to go now. And so you just kind of look at it that way. The lady granted us another interview. It wasn't as good because it wasn't, impromptu. It wasn't improvised, but it was all right. And ultimately, even that bad second oral history interview was better than nothing. So don't worry, you are going to mess up. I recommend, if you're going to be embarking on a community oral history project, I think it's really interesting. If you look at this, you see the swirl on the burner on my grandmother's cookbook, and you look at this and it's got this swirl pattern on it. But this is your cookbook for community oral history projects. And I'm not endorsing this. You can use whatever you want. You don't have to buy a book. I'm just saying that this might be helpful. It has, I reviewed this for a journal and use it myself all the time. And everything that I'm going to go over from now on, you can find this in the book. So don't feel like you have to take notes after notes after notes. This is going to be a good guide to you as well. So first things first, before you sit down and do anything, and it sounds like you all have already done this, you kind of have a team in place, right? Just by the nature of your organization. And I really think that most oral history projects have to be tackled as a team. Unless it's your full-time job, it is not something you should try to do alone. The first thing you want to do is determine a topic and a scope. Because a lot of time what happens is the more people you meet, the more people you interview, you start going in this direction, in that direction, in this direction. But if you say to yourself, we are going to be interviewing people about this historic event or talking about this concept, what it's like to live in or something like that, you can always say, let's put this in the parking lot. We'll do this for another project. We think that's an interesting idea, but let's focus on that. And that'll keep you going and keep people from getting burnt out and feeling like this is going to go on forever and it's daunting and too much to bite off, right? And then get the right people together. Maybe not right now, but in future projects, you could have a focus group or a meeting of representatives of groups of people that you might be affected by your project. So for example, if I'm going to be doing interviews with veterans, obviously I'm going to want to take some time to go to the VFW or the American Legion or another of those groups that represents veterans in my community and ask them what questions we should be asking and who we should be asking them of. And so sometimes you build a little advisory group. You don't have to keep it going the whole time. You get them together, you serve them some coffee and cookies, and you tell them what you're doing and ask them how you might go about doing it. And that's really all you need to do. And you want to have a lot of varied skills and experience. I always tell people to involve youth in local academic programs. You obviously are already doing that. That's part and parcel to what you're doing. And remember that everybody experiences place differently. So you want to have multiple interviewers on your team because you know that people have biases and they're going to want to talk to people that they feel comfortable with. There are oral history interviews that I am never going to be able to get from a man. And that's not because that person is prejudiced or awful or terrible. It's just that maybe a 60-year-old man is going to act a different way around a 40-year-old woman than he would another 60-year-old man. So you really want to think about that in terms of who you're interviewing. The same thing with race and ethnicity. There were times in our country, and there are still obviously issues today that might make it difficult for an African-American person or a Black person to talk to me. And I understand that. They don't owe me their story. And it is my job as an interviewer to accept that and make sure that my team has representation on it that would offer them the comfort in that setting. And that's one thing I like to emphasize is people don't owe you their story. And when they give it to you, they are giving you a gift and you have to treat it that way. So keep that in mind. And then sometimes, not everybody is gifted in this process. Like I said, anyone can do it, but not everybody is a great interviewer. Luckily, with a project like this, there are multiple roles and everybody can serve their role. Some people will say, I'm very comfortable with the equipment. And so you can go and have someone to monitor the equipment who's quiet in the interview and have someone ask questions. That takes a lot of stress off of the interviewer, especially when you're doing your first interviews and you're not quite comfortable with it yet. There's somebody, once you get those interviews done, you want to do what I call pre-archiving, which is somebody who keeps track of the projects, the person that holds all the release forms and makes sure that all of the interviews get taken off the little memory cards and put on. You're going to want to have somebody to do that. And there's also, suppose you want to get some money later on down the road for your project, you can have a grant writer. You can have a project director who's simply the person that has the overview. They're the ones that keep everyone on mission. They're the ones that write like a one-pager about it and make sure that everybody's using the same language when they communicate about the project. The only thing that I would say is that if you're building a team and you're going to add people to your project, you want to be honest about the time commitment. This can be a time-consuming thing. And both the interview time and the preparation for it. And even afterwards, when you get back, there's still some housekeeping things that need to be done. So you want to make sure you're not deluding people about how much time they're going to be investing. So once you've built a team, you are going to want to answer these questions. And that book I showed you, it takes you step by step through answering these questions. And interestingly, the last thing you will do, which is taking your interviews to an archive, is the first thing that you need to think of, because they're going to have some policies in place that you're going to want to have to follow through the whole process. Before you get started, before you hit record on the first interview, you want to be thinking about or have in place where you want these interviews to go. Because if you don't, what happens? They end up in somebody's basement and they never see the light of day. Or they end up on somebody's hard drive on their computer. That computer, something happens and they're gone forever. So where will they go? We are a repository here at KHS. We will take interviews. Some local libraries will, some colleges will, some historical societies are capable, but you want to talk to somebody about taking your interviews permanently, because some of them, and this is the second question, will have paperwork that they want you to sign. So for example, if they are coming to the Historical Society, we have our release form that we want you to use. All right, and that might be true for others. If they don't, you can make your own, no big deal. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you decide that repository, they may have the paperwork that they need you to do. What will the interviews be about? We talked about scope. You know, some people will be like, I want to, no offense, but they'll be like, I want to interview every old person in my county. That is not a scope. That is a fool's errand. You want to talk about what the topic is going to be and how you're going to keep this concise, right? All right, so you're going to interview everybody over 86 in your community about what? About what aspect of life in your community? What do you want to look at? Do you want to look at gender relations? Do you want to look at occupations? Do you want to look at hobbies? Like what is the content of the interviews? And again, if you have good ideas, save it for the next project. We'll focus on this right now. Who will you interview? All right, so you've determined your scope. Who do you already know represents occupations in your area? You know, if it's forestry, whose grandpa worked in the forest industry? Whose uncle works in the forest industry? Who do you have to talk to already? And that list will grow. The more people you interview, the more people you find to interview, because they will tell you about their friends and stuff. And then what equipment will you use? We'll talk about that a little bit too. How will you do research? Like I said, you never do an oral history and take it outside of the other historical record. And to get your questions, to inform your questions, you are going to have to know about the topic. If you want to ask people about the forest industry and you're not a logger yourself, guess what you're going to have to find out? What is it? What are the jobs? What has it been like in your area? What's the demographics? You know, was it men, women? Was it people of a certain race? Were there immigrants coming in to do the work? You know, things that you're going to have to know all of these things and do research in a library or in a historical society, or at least look up the Wikipedia article on Google about it, if nothing else. And then what questions will you ask? And the cool thing is, for the project, you should come up with a core set of like 5 questions that everyone's going to ask. But then the rest of the questions you'll ask in an interview is going to be pretty specific to that person. But you do want to come up with at least a good 5 core questions that relate to that scope that you were talking about. And the cool thing about this, if you take this slide right here and you put it on a piece of paper and you write a 1-page about it, if someone's saying, hey, what's this project you all are doing? You've got it. Hey, we want to give you money for this project. Can you tell us what we're doing? Well, actually, we have all of these questions already answered, so you can rest assured that your money is safe with us. This is essentially how you communicate. By answering this question, this is how you communicate your project to the people you're interviewing, to people that might want to give you money, and to, I mean, a lot of times you'll get a reporter asking you, what are you doing? What are you doing with all these kids in your community, asking a bunch of questions. So let's talk about some of these questions in depth. We talked about an archive, right? So what is a good archive or repository? It's somebody that can accept this type of material. So a lot of places can accept cassette tapes. That's easy. They just go in a box on a shelf. Not a lot of places can accept digital media and do something with it. So you want to make sure that they understand that you're not going to hand them a box of tapes. You're going to be handing them a hard drive, and they need to do something with it to make sure it's accessible online or accessible to visitors. It's climate controlled because you are going to have some paperwork involved in it. You're going to be doing release forms that need to stay with those interviews, and you're going to want to have background information about the interview on paper. So how you spell those people's names, some of the proper names that they use. You know how it is. There's some places, there's a place in Kentucky called Sweden. It's spelled S-W-E-E-D-N. The Sweden in Europe is just S-W-E-D-N. That's the kind of stuff that you want to put on the paperwork so that people understand the area that you're talking about when they like view it online or stream it online. You want to go somewhere that employs trained personnel. Don't put it to one of those like Coca-Cola museums in someone's barn, you know, like a roadside attraction. You want to have folks that have some librarian or archival training. And then you want it to be open to the public somehow. You're going to do a lot of work on this project, right? You want people to listen to them and see them. If you take it to somewhere that doesn't know how to deal with these interviews, they'll just sit and collect dust somewhere. And that breaks my heart. That's the worst thing you can do. You might as well have not done the interview if nobody can access it. And I would say somewhere that makes sense with the project. So for example, if you're doing interviews about coal mining, don't send them all the way to Washington, D.C., send them to the Coal Mining Museum, right? You want to make sure that the scope that you picked makes sense with the repository. We're a good answer because basically we collect all things Kentucky. So our scope is pretty vast. All right, so like I said, when you choose your repository, they may or they may not have paperwork for you to do, but regardless, you either use theirs or you make one of your own. In that book I showed you, there are templates where you can make a project release agreement. For oral history interviews, because it's intellectual property, just like a book or music or anything else, you want to make sure that you get this document if they're going to be for public use. Okay. And I don't accept any interviews in my repository that don't have one of these. And it's not for legal agreement reasons, it's for ethical reasons. I want to make sure that the person that was interviewed knows exactly what they were being interviewed for and that they consented to it. These deeds of gift or legal release agreements have 3 parties. Generally, it's the repository or the project, the interviewer, and the interviewee. Those 3 folks all share copyright. And what that means is it's going to come to us, we're going to share it with the public, and we're not going to let anybody use it that hasn't gone through the proper steps, right? But that does not negate any sort of use that you as the interview want to have with it, and it still belongs to the interviewee. And the other thing that you always want to offer on these documents is the opportunity to do a restriction. You don't want to make a big deal about it because you don't want people, because sometimes people will do an interview and they'll come back to you and say, you know, I said something kind of impolite about my sister-in-law that I'm not really proud of. And, you know, you don't want to get into things like that. But for example, I just did an interview with former Governor Steve Beshear. He put a 25-year restriction on his interview. Why do you think that might be? Why would Steve Beshear restrict his interview? You can put it in the chat or you can unmute. Politics, absolutely. He has a a relative that's still currently in politics. So, and it's like Steve, like he's my best friend. It's like Governor Beshear said, you know, anything that he says can be taken out of context and used against his son. So that's understandable. You always want to make those restrictions a time frame and not, a lot of people say, oh, I want it restricted till after my death. Sir, I'm not checking the obituaries every day in Perry County to make sure that you are still alive. Please just say 25 years, 50 years or something like that. So you want that to time. And the other thing that people can say is that I want these in the archives and I want people to come in and use them, but I don't want them up online where everybody can hear my business. That's fine too. You can say not for public access, only for research purposes, something like that. So allow people to do that if they need to, but you don't want to make a big deal out of it because then you'll be people saying, I want you to take every time I said out. Can you cut off the last 15 minutes? No, we're not doing all of that. I have enough to do. The other thing that you're going to be doing is data sheets, like I said, and those are going to have those proper nouns and things on them. I can give you all an example of that too. They don't have to be extensive. You don't have to basically transcribe the interview, but just give the archivist a heads up about anything that might be unique to your area, last name, spelling, stuff like that. And then indexes are nice. They take time, but they're a nice thing to hand to the repository. Your interview is going to be accessible faster if you do that. And what that is when you go through and you mark when the topic changes by the time. So you'll say at 1 minute and 40 seconds, the topic changed. We were talking about what they did, what the games that they played when they were a child. And that way researchers will know, oh, okay, I'm interested in that topic, but not everything else in the interview. I'm going to go directly to that. So equipment, that was one of the questions on that list too. Do you all already have equipment available that you're going to be using?
That's one thing I was going to ask you. We have a task cam recorder. Well, I have a task cam recorder. I plan on getting a couple of more.
Okay.
What do you think about the recording apps on like the iPhones or like that?
Yeah, okay, I can talk about all that. So, your consideration, first of all, is what's your comfort level? Second, what can you afford? You don't want to break the bank. We have a very high recording standard. It's 96 kilohertz and 24-bit. And not every recorder can do that. iPhones are wonderful. They have changed the world. Unfortunately, they're not going to record at a high enough standards for what you need. But what I will say is if you have a laptop, you can get an external microphone for that and use those recording apps. Like Audacity is a free recording app that you can get that will not only let you record, it will let you edit things later if you want to make podcast episodes or put clips up on SoundCloud or something like that. So if you're looking for like a adaptable, easy to use for something you already have, I recommend the laptop and the USB microphone rather than your phones. Unfortunately, we're just not there with phones. A lot of times, even if you are able to get them to record at a high standard, they don't have the memory to do a whole interview, because oral history interviews last between 45 and 120 minutes. And that's very specific. And Emily, you might know why. Anybody who dealt with this technology might be able to tell you, why do you think oral history interviews tend to be between 45 and 120 minutes? 45 minutes is one side of a 90-minute cassette tape or both sides of a 120-minute cassette tape, but they still tend to run that long, to be honest. But the thing is, with the SD cards that we use in the media now, you could record for 6 hours if you wanted to. Please don't. It's exhausting. But so I always say, even if you're not going to be using external microphones now, because it can be expensive, you can buy something that accepts external microphones and always buy them in the future if you decide to upgrade. So this little recorder on the top right, that is similar to the Tascam, some of the Tascam things you'll see out there, but that's a Zoom H4n. That's what we use. The microphones that are on it are really good, but it also has ports in the back so that if you want to upgrade later, you can. So I recommend those two. The Tascam DR40 is very similar to that. It's basically their version. And how does it store files? You always want to try to use something like, the thing about an iPhone in particular, it doesn't have external media. You can't put a card or a chip in it. It records directly on your phone. I prefer something that uses stored media, and I particularly prefer something that uses nothing any smaller than an SD card. I don't know. You can't see my camera and the screen right now, can you? It's just my screen. Or can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay. Well, this one, you don't want to use anything any smaller than this. The reason why is media is kind of funky. It is very easy to become corrupt. I don't know if you've ever had like one of these, or even like a flash drive that it worked one day and then the next day you go to put it in your computer and it's like, sorry, no files. You know, it can be heartbreaking when it does that. And these are the most stable of this kind. So I know for certain those Zoom H4n still accept this kind of media, and that's what you want to try to get if you can. I am going to purchase a bunch of the next step down Zoom, and they take something a little smaller and they only have external microphones. But if that's what you can afford and that's what people on your team can use, and they still record at 96 kilohertz 24-bit, then that's what you get. These are the guidelines, you know, pick 5 if you can't do, you know, or it's 5, pick 3 if you can't do all 5. Basically do the best you can. So these are just some options that scale. That Mix Pre 3 at the top is expensive and hard to use. I don't even use one of these. And like I said, probably the most versatile. So if you know, like, we're only doing one oral history project, this is not going on forever. The best one is the laptop with the USB microphone, because that USB microphone could be used for conference calls and a lot of other things later if you don't do oral history project. To record board meetings, that's another thing that they're good for. And that is a Blue Yeti Pro. They're $270, but they're the only USB microphone that can record at that quality that we're looking at. They're pretty portable and they're really easy to use. And like I said, that gives you the option of using it for something else later if you need to. So I have a few of those too. And I have a funny story about this. So I'm really into audio recording equipment. I collect records. I have a huge stereo. And this woman who did interviews in the 70s, before she started a career as a teacher, had just retired and she wanted to get back into it. And she calls me and says, you know, I started doing this with cassette tapes. I don't know anything about the new stuff. And I talked her through some options, and I think I talked her into the Zoom H4n, which is about $200. And she says, well, I'm gonna have to go back and talk to my husband. I'm not sure if that's an investment we can make right now. And I said, well, that's fine. You know, and I told her the same thing I told you, which is it's 5 criteria, you know, pick 3. And she called me back and she said, well, okay, what else can you do? Because my husband said no, what do I need? And I almost said, you need a new husband because nobody's going to tell me. But, you know, just you're going to get a good piece of equipment, think at least $200. If you're paying less than $200 for it, you might be looking at something that's not going to work for your purposes. And, you know, you can have 2 or 3 and rotate them around. And just keep in mind too, that equipment also includes permanent storage. So you're going to want to be thinking about, as we're doing this project, these files are huge. They can get into the gigabytes. And so you're going to want to think about external hard drives and cloud storage and places to store this stuff until it goes to a repository to keep it safe. So put that on your list too.
We already have a NAS. It's called a NAS. It's an external drive. It's got 2 external drives in it, and I forget how many terabytes are each one of them. So
yeah, if you got terabytes, you're fine. That should do you. If you're looking at terabytes instead of gigabytes, you're already in the right range. So we do offer support for equipment. Like we have a technical assistance program where I will loan you the same equipment that I advocated that you get. It comes with training. You're already doing the training. It's like a grant. It's just not money. It's equipment. It's a rotating deadline. You can fill it out anytime and borrow stuff from us. I'll tell you, we're real low on equipment right now because as soon as the pandemic started sort of cycling down, people were like, I need to borrow equipment right now. I've been putting off this project for a whole year. So, and then coming soon, like I said, I'm going to be purchasing a bunch of equipment and I'm going to hand it over to the Kentucky Department of Library and Archives. And they're going to have those through the interlibrary loan system. So you can go in your local public library and say, I want to do an interview with my grandma and borrow equipment and bring it back. And that's what that's really made for. It's not so much community oral history projects. It's more for like those folks that call me and say, you know, I have a friend, he's in a nursing home. I want to make sure that I get his story. It's for that type of scenario, like off interview, but spread the word about that. It's also for like coursework. You know, if you have a history class and you want to do a project and you want to record a good interview, you can borrow that to do those. So setting up an interview. The first, when you find an interviewee for your project and you choose them, you always talk to them on the phone or remotely first, sort of a pre-interview. And this is a good time to think about the kind of specific questions you're going to want to ask them that are in addition to those 5 big topics or whatever that you come up with your project. It's also a good time to build a little bit of a relationship because like I said, someone is not going to give you the intimate details of your life if you're a stranger. So if you build some rapport or build a relationship with them, it's going to make that interview, that sit down interview easier. This also gives you a time to determine off limits topics. I'm not sure what the scope of your project is, but for example, I knew that Steve Bashir was not interested in talking about casino gambling. It's a sore subject for his administration, and we were going to skip that. And I said, that is just fine. And then the next thing you're going to do is pick a location. We're fortunate here in that we have an audio studio. However, most people would be preferred to be interviewed in their homes, and that's fine. But here's the thing you have to remember about location is that your home may feel quiet, but when you turn a recording device on, it is picking up everything in that room, even if you're focusing the microphone in the right direction. Your HVAC system, your air conditioning system, apparently on this time of year where it's hot, is loud. And the worst thing is people almost always want to do interviews in their kitchen, which is it's where there's comfortable, it's where you can get a drink. It's also where there's a table and chairs and you can set the equipment up. Your refrigerator is so loud. You don't even know how loud your refrigerator is until you turn that on. So I was this picture of these ice boxes from our collection. I wish people still had ice boxes because I were quiet. And I actually have colleagues that will go in people's houses, take their car keys and put it in the freezer and unplug the refrigerator and say, I've unplugged your refrigerator because it is loud, but I will definitely remember to turn it back on because my car keys are in the freezer and I can't get out of here without them. Don't do that. I think that's just a little too much. I don't think that's not good guest behavior. It's more important to maintain your relationship with that person than it is to get the interview. But be mindful of noises around you that you don't hear anymore because you're used to them. So you're gonna want to pick a quiet location. With family members, it is very tempting to want to do an interview around a holiday because that's when you see folks. However, I hate holiday interviews that come in here because what happens is it's at Thanksgiving. And in addition to hearing the interview, what you hear is aunts and grandma in the kitchen rattling pots and pans and screaming back and forth and people laughing. It is just too hectic. So you really want to find a dedicated time that is outside of a holiday to do an interview and be honest with them about how much time it's going to take. Like I said, between 45 and 120 minutes, but we live in Kentucky. You got to get there. You got to have coffee. You got to chat. That's at least 30 minutes. You got to have the interview. And then you got to have the post-interview conversation. And then you have to say goodbye on the porch. And then you have to say goodbye in the car. And, you know, and then it turns into, it's about double. Whatever the interview is, double it because that's how much time. Plus you have to set up your equipment. That might take a little bit of time too, especially if you're not real comfortable with it. And that leads me to test your equipment. I have used this equipment for years. I always set it up the night before and just make sure I remember that it's a muscle memory to press that right button and that everything's in working order. You know how technology is. If it can fail, it will fail. So testing it, even if you're familiar. And I absolutely never, ever, ever give my questions in advance. Can anybody think of a reason why you would not want to give your question in advance?
They might hear that question and say, I don't want to answer that.
That doesn't bother me as much, but what happens when you give your questions in advance? A lot of times that you'll get an interview where they've done that. If you've ever watched one of those like accident lawyer where they have a testimonial and the person is standing there with their eyes like this and they'll say, I got $5,000 when I called Daryl Isaacs, and they give you a scripted answer and you really want these to be off the cuff. I definitely give them topics in advance. I say, well, you know, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your family life and what it was like growing up in Perry County. And then I want to know about your job and tell me what it was like getting into politics and things like that. But you don't give the specific questions in advance. Otherwise, they're going to be reading them off of a piece of paper. And it's like, well, you could have just written that to me. That's not what I'm looking for. So don't give them in advance. So research and questions, like I said, oral history is never taken outside of the whole historical record. They are part of the historical record. So you never want to ask answered questions. And what I mean by that is if you are interviewing somebody about an event, so for example, the March on Washington, you don't want to ask them what the date of that event was. We know what the date of that event was. You do your research in advance and you have that knowledge in front of you. You want to formulate open-ended questions. So we never want to ask a question where the answer can be just yes or no. Like, was life good in the 1970s? Yes or no? You know what I mean? You're not going to get that kind of good quality response we're looking for. However, you will want to, it's different when you're clarifying a point. Like you said, oh, when you're talking about the river, do you mean the Big Sandy? Yes or no? That's fine. But your big questions should not be yes or no. I always like to ask day in the life questions. So, oops, go back. Not there. You asked me if I had any personal points about getting people to open up to me. One of those is by asking what I call day in the life or experiential questions. A lot of people want to start out with those like biographical questions, like where were you born? Who was your mom? Things like that. The problem with that is if you start out with a trend of short answers, it is really hard to get out of it. People start expecting to give you short answers. Skip all that. You can do it at the end or you could look it up later. That's one of those answered questions. We could look at birth and death records. Don't worry about that. Ask a day in the life questions. So for example, describe to me a typical day in the office when you were lieutenant governor under Martha Lane Collins. That's a day in the life question. And they have to take you from what they had for breakfast all the way to putting their head on the pillow at night. And you start a trend of long answers that way. I really, particularly with occupations, that's a good question. For example, don't say, what was it like working in a factory? Because you know what they're going to say? It was hard. Thank you. Yes, we know that. That's why you paid money for it. It was hard. But if you ask, what was it like? Take me through a typical day when you walked on the floor. How did you get ready to go to work? What kind of equipment you need? Things like that. Then you're going to get a lot better answers. Keep the topics broad and you got to be agile, right? So you're going to ask a broad question, but you're also going to be sitting there writing like little follow-up notes. Like, for example, oh, he mentioned this word. I don't think people know what that means. And so, you know, you're going to say, tell me about a day in your life, but then you're going to go back and say, now you mentioned a team leader. What was a team leader's role? Okay, how is that different from a foreman? Oh, all right. So what does it mean? You know, that you're going to be writing those things down and ask those follow-up questions after your big broad topic. And then you don't ever want to lead an interviewee towards your hypothesis. If you have some theory about what it was like to work in a factory, keep it to yourself, because it will make you ask leading question. And a leading question is, and I have a good example of it later in the presentation, is one for which the person answering the question has no other way than to answer it in a way that confirms what you already think. So for example, if you say, weren't things better back in the past? Well, they can either say yeah, or they can argue with you, but it's a leading question. It implies that you already think that, right? So make sure that your questions are open and that you're not imposing your own ideas about what you think on the interview. You are neutral. You're objective as you can be about what they are going to say. So here's the tips and techniques that everybody wanted to know more about, particularly about getting people to open up and getting a good interview. And hopefully, I think I have set this share properly so that you can hear the audio, but we'll do a test with the first one. So the first thing that you're going to do is you will turn your equipment on and you're going to be looking at the levels and making sure that everything is loud enough and that their microphone is positioned. And while you're doing that, you're going to ask a softball question that doesn't have anything to do with the interview, right? So for example, my softball question, and this comes from radio, they always ask, what did you have for breakfast? And the reason why I ask, what did you have for breakfast, is because everybody is an expert on what they had for breakfast. You're the only one who can answer that. And it establishes them as an expert, right? They feel more confident. They've said something to you, they've answered a question properly, and you've also just made some conversation. So this is an intern I had named Emma, and she is asking a softball question, and I'm going to use this to make sure that you all can hear this audio. So give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
So, Mr. McKinney, I'm going to ask you a very superficial question to start, to set the levels on my recording here. What did you have for breakfast this morning?
You know, I had my standard breakfast of Cheerios and milk and coffee every morning.
Gotcha. Okay, the levels look good.
So we found out later on, Mr. McKinney is very interested in health. And so even though that was a silly question, it was kind of telling, you know, he was interested in heart health, so he had Cheerios. And it put him at ease. Is anybody here sort of like weird about hearing their own voice on a recording? Like when they hear it played back, they're like, you can just raise your hand or not. You'll get over it. You really will. Like the more you hear it, the less you'll care. I don't care anymore. I'll do radio interviews. It's just like anything else. The more you confront it, the less scary it'll be. So the next thing you want to do after you hit record is you want to give an introduction. And this is just basic. You'll say, my name is Sarah Schmitt. I'm with the Kentucky Oral History Commission, and today I'll be interviewing Emily Hudson about her life in Perry County, Kentucky. It is July the 1st, and we are at her home. Ms. Hudson, do you agree to be recorded for this interview, right? And that's very important. So you want to give the introduction, and what that does for us is, God forbid, all of that paperwork gets separated. I still have some evidence that you consented to be recorded and you were okay with being recorded. And we know the date, the place, and at least who we're talking to. I do have some people go so far as to spell out the whole name and everything. That just keep it short. We'll, it's all right. And here's an example of an extra introduction that I did for my grandmother. The most nerve-wracking interview that I have ever done is one with my grandmother. I can interview strangers all day, but there was something about doing this one with her. I gave way too many details, but oops. Today is July the 19th, 2017. This is Sarah M. Schmitt, the administrator for the Kentucky Oral History Commission, interviewing Jean Ann Morgan Williams for the Veterans Oral History Project. We are in Lexington, Kentucky at 3060 Pritchard Drive. It's 5:17 in the evening, and we're going to be talking about Jean's service in the Naval Reserves as a wave. You do not have to go that far. You don't have to don't give anybody's address, actually. Nobody lives at that house anymore, so don't go there, but don't go to it is what I mean. But you don't have to give us the time of day, but at least give us the place, the people's names, the date, and ask them if they consent to be recorded. And then, like I said, you want to start a trend of long answers. So for example, when Emma was formulating her questions to ask to Mr. McKinney, who was the county judge executive of Boyle County, Danville, she was going to ask them all like, who's your mom? Who's your dad? When were you born? I was like, we can look all that up or we can ask him later. You really want to ask him something else that's going to give you a longer response. And this is what she chose.
So Mr. McKinney, tell us a little bit about your time serving as the county judge executive of Boyle County. How did you get to this position?
I was appointed in 2008 by Governor Stephen Beshear.
So rather than asking him, when were you elected? She just said, how did you get to this place? That could be anything. He could have been, well, I was born on, or he could say, well, when I went to college, I always wanted to be a politician. He chose to start with his appointment, but that at least got us to the question at hand, which was his career, right? So one thing I'm guilty of that I need to really work on, I'm terrible about asking too many questions at once. My brain starts going like this, and I can't, get it down to one concise thought. And I'll be like, I'll ask 5 questions at once. Don't be like me. Avoid that. Here's an example of me doing that poorly. What did you have plans for what you were going to do when the war was over? Or was
I was going to get married. I had plans.
And so about how long, what was that like, the transition going from having been living in a hotel to, how long did that take? What did you do in the in-between time?
Well, he got out in February. He came back from China, Burma, India in February.
So as you can hear, I asked her about, in the second set of questions, I asked her 4 different questions, and you can tell she was kind of like, well, what? She went, well, and she's like, well, I'm just going to start talking because I'm not even sure which of these questions to answer. Make sure you're asking just one question at a time. The other thing that's really hard to get into the habit of, that I'm actually really good at, is confirming that you're listening non-verbally. So keep in mind, people are going to be listening to and using this interview in the future. If you all have plans of making podcast episodes or making clips for SoundCloud, you don't want to interview where somebody's talking and in between you hear someone going, mm-hmm, uh-huh, oh, really? Remember, it's not a conversation. We should not be hearing very much of you. We should be hearing mostly them. And so I was teaching my intern, Emma, I said, you have to really learn how to do this. You turn into a mime. So someone says something shocking and you're like, oh, or, you don't make a noise if you can help it. You really learn to be expressive with your face if you can. Well, some people find that weird, especially politicians. They're used to, or preachers especially, they want the verbal feedback. They want the amen. They want the confirmation that you heard what they said. So this is one time where it backfired, but still you want to do it if you can.
An unhealthy person is not a good worker. I don't care how well trained you are. I don't care how smart you are. If you're sick, you're not going to be a good employee. It's just that simple. And you can talk about training and you can talk about education. If you're not healthy, you're not going to be a good employee. Am I right?
Right.
See, that's where you can say, yes, it's where I'm playing with you.
You're going to untrain her.
What?
I said you're going to untrain her.
Well, I intend
We're supposed to nod.
Well, I understand that, but you know what we're doing? We're having a conversation.
No, we're not, Mr. McKinney. This is an interview. But so basically, he was talking and he's given his speech about health that he's used to giving as a politician. And he's used to people nodding their heads and saying, yes, I agree. Well, she was just nodding and he said, well, this is where you're supposed to say yes. And I was like, and she looked at me like, I don't know what to do. And I said, stop, you're going to untrain her. So do, if you possibly can, confirm that you're listening non-verbally. And that way, when you use it for a radio show later on, you don't have to cut out all the yes, amen sort of confirmations that we're used to doing in a conversation. It can feel a little bit weird at first. Another thing that feels a little bit weird is being okay with silence. In a conversation, we are used to giving immediate feedback so that that person knows that we're listening. So for example, if your friend was like, oh God, I hate her. She is always you're always like, me too, and you want to really like establish a relationship that way. But you will find that if you be quiet for a minute and let that silence sit uncomfortably in the air, they will say more. They will keep going. And they may give you something that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise if you had waited for your turn to talk. Have you ever been talking to somebody and you could tell that they weren't listening? They were just waiting for their turn to talk. Yeah, this is the opposite of that. You are listening intently. So what I do is to check myself. When a person stops talking, I take my hand, I put it on my thigh. They can't see me doing it. And I put my fingers down on my thigh, like 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. I give it 5 seconds before I ask the next question. Sometimes they will continue talking. Sometimes they will let you know, I'm done, time to move on to the next question. But you have to learn to be okay with silence. Another thing you don't want to do is don't interrupt. Handle tangents gracefully. People will get off topic. And all you have to say, once they finish that thought, you can say, thank you for telling me that story. That was really interesting. I do want to go back to what you said about healthy workers, though. If we can backtrack for just a minute, let people talk. Who knows? The thing is, you never know how interviews are going to be used in the future. And so maybe that researcher was looking for exactly what was in that tangent. Don't get me wrong, keep it to the scope, but don't interrupt people and say, excuse me, that's not what we're talking about. And don't argue. If somebody says something wrong, if somebody uses the wrong name, the wrong date, or they just say something that you just know is not correct, it's okay. Don't feel like you have to interrupt and correct them. Just let it go. Like I said, try not to ask leading questions. This is the most egregious example of asking a leading question I've ever heard. So here it goes.
What would you say between those days and the days we live in now? Were they more peaceful and were you more at ease in your early days than the public is today?
Sure, more ease.
Would you say that life was easier?
Life was easier. And say, there's a few people and we had no trouble with one another.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
There was a few people and we had no trouble with one another. We didn't have antibiotics. We had to use separate watering fountains, but things were so much better back in the day. Basically, that man asked questions that person, first of all, they were open-ended. So that's wrong to begin with. And then he asked a question that all he could do, unless he was argumentative, was agree. We all got along with each other. Well, at least the people that look like you and live the same life you did, I'm sure you all really did get along with each other, but there's more to the story than that. And whatever you think, if you think that life in the past was better, keep that to yourself. That's not what the interview is about. So as I said before, be ready with follow-up questions. You're going to ask your broad questions, but you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to really go in the direction if they're giving you some good details. And here's an example with my grandmother. I had a bunch of questions all lined up after this one, but she mentioned something that made me go in a different direction.
Do you feel like at the time that anybody treated you different because you were a woman in uniform versus a man in uniform, or do you think that it was mostly equal?
Oh no, it wasn't equal. They really didn't. They really didn't. Even today, when they write an article about, even in my church bulletin, they write the article and they say the men serving in our country or who served in our, and they don't say the men and the women. They just say, and now the women are serving in the line. But I never would have gone in if I had to shoot a gun or anything or get on a ship. I got on a ship in Cleveland. I got on a submarine, but I just got on it to look at it. I didn't want to go out to sea.
Why was there a submarine in Cleveland?
Oh, Lake Erie was there, and it just parked there, so probably just for to show it off,
Exhibition.
Yeah.
So I had a bunch of questions lined up about what it was like to be a woman in uniform in the 1940s and how that may be a different experience than a man. But skirt, she said, submarine in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was like, well, we got to talk about that for a minute. Why would there have been a submarine in Lake Erie, right? So that was my grandmother. She passed away last year. She's my feminist hero. She chose to go into the Navy because they had better uniforms than the other branches. She liked them. They were by a designer that she liked. So anyway, be prepared to ask different questions. If they give you some cool details, go down that path. It's fine, especially if it's on scope. So like I said, ask for specific examples. So a lot of times people will tell you, like I said, the factory questions, say, oh, it was hard. You will go into interviews with folks who it's like pulling teeth. Even if you ask that wonderful experiential question, you're just not getting anything out of them. They are just, it's hard. It was good. It was fun. So ask for concrete examples. How was it hard? How did you feel? How did that make you feel? And then if they're really not giving you any things, you can start asking for sensory details. You can say, how did it feel? Like, what was the temperature? How did it smell? What did it look like? Have them give you what they collected with their eyes, their ears, their mouths, their hands, that will let you know what that life was like. And then last but not least, look for signs of exhaustion. You can kind of tell when an interview's winding down. Sometimes you get tired. You're just not asking good questions anymore. Here's how I know that the interview's done for me. I start talking back. It turns into a conversation and I'm like, I need to stop. So when I was talking to or doing the interview with Steve Bashir, he mentioned the fact one of his leadership mottos is that once you sit down and you break bread with somebody, you can never not see them as human again. That if you want to get to know what's going on with people's life, if you want to get somewhere in politics, if you want to know your enemy better, you need to sit down, have a drink with them, eat a meal. And he went on about that. And then I had to answer back and say, I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the way that Christ did his ministry, was to sit down with people that society didn't like prostitutes or to sit down with people that didn't agree with him, like Pharisees. That was his, you always hear about him sitting at the table with people and sharing a meal. And then I was like, oh, this interview's over, because I'm exhausted, because now it's turned into a conversation. It was relevant, but it wasn't helpful. So look for signs of exhaustion like that. Or if somebody who's used to giving long answers starts giving really short ones, looking at their watch, it's time to wind it down. Even if you don't get to all of your questions, you can come back and do a second interview. Sometimes the second interview is even better because you've had time to review what you asked, and you can ask even better follow-up questions. Don't wear people out if you don't have to. And then immediately when you're done with that interview, take those audio files and move them to a hard drive or a server as soon as you can. The rule is redundancy. As many copies of that interview as you have in different places, the less likely it is to get lost. You want to name them something consistent. Name the file, that is. Some repositories are going to give you what they want you to name it, but basically sit down in that question answering session that I was talking about with your group and come up, we're going to name it the last name and the date or something like that. Because what will happen is you'll name it something goofy that makes sense at the time, and then you can't find it. That's the worst thing, is when the interview's there, but you've named it something ridiculous or at least inconsistent with the project and you can't find it. Then the great thing about using a laptop is you can give a copy of the interview to the interviewee right then and there. If you have one of these little flash drives, I would encourage you, if it's in your budget, to buy a bunch of these that are branded with your logo or something like that. It's a good marketing tool. And it's also a way to give that interview. They are owed a copy of their interview. They gave you that story, you should give it back to them. And then don't write them an email. Don't send them a text. Write them a handwritten thank you note. I am keeping the note card industry and business. I have a stack of them on my desk. I sent the former governor a handwritten thank you note. That's just what you do. There's so much technology involved in this that you got to keep that human relationship human. And so always do that. Complete your interview information form and then do an index it if you can. Don't wait to do that interview information form, because what will happen is once that interview is over, you want to move away from it and move on to the next thing. You will be tired of thinking about it. Do it as soon as you can before you start losing steam on that interview. So my last thought about this before I go to some questions, I would have asked for questions earlier, but it's very hard for me to look at the chat while looking at the screen. But I'm going to give you some time to do that, is share, please share. The worst part about this is, particularly with our interviews, we have 10,000 of them, but because they just sit here in my archive. Think of ways that you can share these online exhibits, upload them to SoundCloud, burn CDs and hand them out. It's old school, but especially for sometimes the demographic we're working with, they do still have CD players. Fill flash drives, buy those little branded flash drives and give parts of the project out to people. Don't let them collect dust. If the folks that signed the release form and said you could use it any way that you want to, consent to that, find a way to share it as much as you can, because you're going to put a lot of work into this, and I think that it has a lot of value, these interviews, and people love clips. They don't like to sit and listen to the whole interview, but I really enjoy sitting and listening to clips. So as you're doing your background information, you might point out, she said something really funny here that I think would be good for the project, or he talked about leadership, and part of the scope of our project is leadership. At minute 18, do that clip. That's the other cool thing about using the laptop. You already have editing software. Audacity is free, and you can use it to cut out those little clips of just things that you want to share. People will tell me, man, I don't have time to sit down and write do a whole podcast for my project. But what you can do is like a weekly minute. That's one thing that Kentucky Historical Society has, is that we do like a radio spot that's just 1 minute long. Don't do something out of your scope, but definitely share if you can. So this is me. And now that I'm back in the office full time, I can be more readily available to answer your questions, but that's what I'm here for, is to be a consultant on these type of things. And I am going to stop the share and look at the chat box and make sure there's no question, or that there are questions. Okay. So that's a good a question about altering their answers. How this works for oral history is what goes in the archive is unedited ever. It is an ethical, that person recorded that interview, that's how they think it's going to be. We never edit what we call the original copy that goes on the server. However, if, for example, they say, hey, I was talking about my sister-in-law in kind of an ugly way in minute 18, is there any way that you can take that out? One compromise you can make is say, we're not going to edit the original, but anything that goes up online will have a restriction on it that we take out minute 45 to 47, where you said nasty things about your family. So when you edit an original, and you erase details from an interview on what they used to call the master copy, we call that Nixoning, after Richard Nixon, after the edited tapes. We do not do that ethically. Now, what you put up online can definitely be edited. One thing I would say is another thing you don't want to do is if you have a clip, you don't want to like take minute 5 to 7 and then start editing within those minutes so that you're clipping things together. That's taking things out of context. You've heard interviews where people, they may have taken out a couple of details or information that made all the difference in the world. So, editing, you want to be as hands-off with that interview as possible. Treat that the way you would want to be treated. Do you want somebody going in? And a lot of times what I'll do, especially if I have email addresses, like if I'm going to use something for a public presentation, I'll send it back to them and say, I want to use this clip. Are you okay with that? Do you don't think it was taken out of context? Do you feel like that represents you well? You maintain that relationship as much as you can, but no, you don't want to edit their answers. I always get that question about how do you get people to open up and speak with you? Part of it is that pre-interview, setting them at ease and letting them, that's your time to talk back and let them know that you're just a person too. The other thing you want to do is you want to emphasize that getting their story is important, but you don't want to make it seem so important that it's intimidating, right? So, it's like, oh, I'm just going to bring a little recorder, we just want to make sure we have it on the record. Let them know that you want their story, but don't make them feel like they're the only one, because sometimes they can be real cagey about that too. And frankly, you asking the open-ended questions, asking for those experiential questions like a day in the life really helps people open up. You cannot do anything about those people that are just not used to speaking. You can do the best you can. But you will run into somebody who's just a brick wall, and it's going to be like pulling teeth to get every answer, and that's okay. And then you will have the opposite end that can be just as problematic. You're going to get that person that's going to tell you everything, and half of it's going to be on topic, and they've got good stories, but they don't have anything to do with your project. So, don't assume that just because people are talking that what you're getting is good content. It's just like reading books. Not all books are great literature. Just because something is long doesn't make it good or clear. So, and it may be that if you do have one of those interviewees that's having a hard time opening up, but they played a really important role, you might have to do multiple interviews. You might have to say, we're going to sit and talk for 45 minutes, but I'm going to see you in 2 weeks and we'll talk for 90 minutes. They just may need time. So, is there any other questions?
Shakina and Christiana, do y'all have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions.
I don't have any either. I've learned what I've needed to know already.
Okay.
Well, the thing, I tend to be, I don't want to ask questions in a workshop with other people around. You have questions you want me to answer via email, I'm happy to do that. And the other thing that'll happen, you'll go to your first interview and you'll be like, I need to know this. Feel free to email me with, I can answer a question anytime. Text
All right.
me, I don't care.
Okay. All right.
Especially about equipment. So,
Okay. Good. Good.
yep.
And I did. I went ahead and ordered that book.
Good.
So I look forward to seeing that. And this has been some great information.
Well,
And
another good tip is to listen to some oral history interviews. If you listen to some good interviews, you'll, it's just like anything else. You can imitate the masters, right?
yeah.
And where you can find that, I'm putting this link right here in the chat box. We have an online tool called Password. It is all of the oral history. It's not just historical societies, it's all of them in the state, but it's sort of like it's sourced content. So it's only as good as the repositories that participate, but that's where you can find some good interviews, particularly from your area. And the nice thing about that is someone will say, oh, you should interview such and such. You'd be like, that's great. We do want to interview George, but you realize he's been interviewed about 18 times, right? Like, who else? Who's missing? There are people missing from this historical record there that need to be documented.
That's great. Great. Because
Thank you.
I have been having them kind of go online and certain historical sites and listen to some interviews and some things. So this is great. We'll check this out. This link out.
Yeah, and you can listen to some of my interviews in there. Some of them are good, some are bad.
Okay.
You can see me breaking my own rules. I do all the time. Do as I say, don't do as I do. So
this is great. This is, great information, and it lets us know too what we really need to do up front, paper-wise and so forth, to make sure we have all that in order before starting. So
yeah, I think the main thing, sitting down and answering those questions and coming up with just a one-page document. And the great thing is, no matter who asks you what you're doing, whether they're internal or external, it's almost like a mission statement. Keeps everybody going the same direction.
Yeah. All right. Well, we sure appreciate you taking time to talk with us today.
Yeah, anytime.
And like I said, it's been great information.
All right. Well, I wish you all success, and like I said, I'm here to help.
All right. I think we may plan a trip in the future to come down and visit.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
All right.
Oh, and I should tell you, my business cards, on the back of them are passes. If you send me your mailing address, I'll send you a packet of them. That way, if for some reason we can't link up or whatever, I know you all will still at least get free entry.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds good. I guess we will conclude this. And again, thank you so much, Sarah. And you have a wonderful day.
Good luck.
All right.